One rumour that seems to be getting traction at the moment is the idea of a Xenoblade Chronicles 2 Nintendo Switch 2 edition, and I wanted to examine it because I'm actually quite skeptical. As far as I can tell, the main source of this rumour was speculation by Nate the Hate on his podcast. Now, while Nate clearly has sources and has shared things in the past that are true, he also does mix in quite a bit of his own speculation, and as far as I can tell, talk of a Xenoblade Chronicles 2 Nintendo Switch 2 edition feels far more speculative wishing than solid sourcing. Now, that's not to say that Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is implausible at all. We've had Xenoblade Chronicles X receive a Nintendo Switch 2 edition this year, and in many respects it would only make sense for Nintendo to roll out the red carpet for the entire Xenoblade trilogy as well, so that each of these cult favourites can be presented in their best form on Switch 2 for the entire generation to come. Also, Monolith Soft has a consistent history of trying to ensure that the games look as good as they can, with the original Xenoblade making Switch in a definitive edition form, despite having already released twice in the prior decade on Wii and on 3DS. In this video, therefore, I want to talk through the multiple reasons why I am quite cautious about this speculation, and then we'll look on balance at how likely such a game is and when it might release, if it is indeed on the cards. So firstly, we need to consider the three Xenoblade titles that have yet to make landfall on Switch 2. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is the most recent, the most graphically lavish already, and presumably would therefore be the easiest to give a glow-up for Switch 2. Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition is the most iconic probably, and is the one that Nintendo will want people to be able to discover because it's one of those legendary evergreen titles in their stable. Then there's Xenoblade Chronicles 2, which has the advantage that it's probably the best-selling title in the series. We can't be fully sure because Nintendo doesn't report in detail on numbers when games don't hit 1 million units in a fiscal year, but it seems likely that it still holds the crown, especially given the information that they released in 2024. And of course, Xenoblade Chronicles X got the nod for being the most recent title of the four, and the one that could benefit from a signal boost after its launch was pretty much eclipsed by the drumbeat of hype for Switch 2's launch. Now, if I'm Nintendo and Monolith Soft deciding on which of these games needs a boost for Switch 2 first, I honestly don't think Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is going to be the first on my list. For one thing, it's graphically the weakest of the four, with the game releasing early in the Switch's lifespan before Monolith Soft had developed the kind of mastery they were later to show, and there's some evidence that it was rushed to meet the 2017 window, given that the game released with question marks over some of the graphics, which were then patched through the early part of 2018. In other words, it would require a lot more work than most of the Xenoblade games. It's also noticeable that generally Nintendo's Nintendo Switch 2 edition titles have tended to focus on more recent games. Obviously, games like Metroid Prime 4 and Pokemon Legends ZA were simultaneous releases anyway, but Super Mario Bros. Wonder, Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition, Super Mario Party Jamboree, and Kirby and the Forgotten Land all were more recent titles, while Animal Crossing New Horizons is the only very long-term evergreen to receive the treatment so far. My suspicion here is that the room for a graphical update was explicitly planned for way back in the production of many of these games, while titles like ARMS, Super Mario Odyssey, Captain Toad and others saw Nintendo hiring the talents of Panic Button and perhaps others to give a far more modest, graphically focused update to the games in question, rather than the kind of expansions that we ultimately saw. It feels very plausible that consideration was made in the development of Xenoblade Chronicles 3 that Nintendo would one day aspire to do a Nintendo Switch 2 edition when the technology evolved to a sufficient point. It feels believable that the same consideration was even in place during the development of Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. I struggle to imagine, though, that they had this in mind during the development of Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but potentially it means that they might have some groundwork in place to make the process a little bit easier of bringing a Nintendo Switch 2 edition to market. Setting aside production considerations though, now let's think about marketing. I haven't fully deep-dived Monolith Soft, but they appear to have two Xenoblade teams, each working at roughly 4 to 5 year intervals on titles. The Xenoblade 2 and 3 team might be expected to have a game in early 2027. The team behind the definitive editions of Xenoblade Chronicles and Xenoblade Chronicles X only released a game in 2025. If the main team have a new Xenoblade game, there's a risk in releasing a Nintendo Switch 2 edition of any prior Xenoblade Chronicles title right now. Xenoblade Chronicles X is a bit of an exception because it's fundamentally different in style from the other titles, and it's building off a game that was within its first year of sales anyway when the Nintendo Switch 2 edition released, and so the Nintendo Switch 2 edition was probably always part of the long-term marketing cycle. However, releasing any of the 3 Xenoblades potentially within 6 to 9 months of a new game feels to me quite dubious, and it's to be noted that Fire Emblem Three Houses and Fire Emblem Engage don't have Nintendo Switch 2 editions either, and probably, I suspect, the presence of Fortune's Weave on the calendar is at least one reason for this. That's not to say we couldn't get a Nintendo Switch 2 edition of any of these games, but I would take that as a sign that new titles are likely to be at least a year out, which may of course be true as well for Xenoblade. But if that is true, it also makes me wonder why their spare capacity at Monolith Soft will be going to fiddly visual upgrades of Xenoblade Chronicles 2 rather than either the more gentle prospect of blowing up Xenoblade Chronicles 3 or probably concentrating all the team's fire on the new Switch 2 visual showcase extravaganza game. Also, while Xenoblade 2 is on paper probably the most popular, that's largely as a fluke of being the first game on a popular console. I personally rather prefer Rex's brio and daring do to Shulk's adventures, which feel relentlessly bleak in the latter third as good a game as it is, but the original Xenoblade Chronicle is a classic for a reason, and in standing stark comparisons, you would expect Xenoblade Chronicles to do better than its sequel, especially if fewer people have purchased the title in the 2020 version. Nintendo and Monolith Soft are also evidently very proud of it, or they wouldn't have put it on 3 systems by now. From a marketing perspective, therefore, Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition feels like the game I would pick for a Nintendo Switch 2 edition before others, probably then followed by Xenoblade Chronicles 3. We also need to consider what this secondary team will do now that it has Xenoblade Chronicles and Xenoblade Chronicles X safely brought to Switch. The obvious option would be for them to remaster another title. Now, there have been rumours of Nintendo buying the rights to Xenogears, and I actually think that these make some sense and might be a good way to utilise this group. But that aside, the obvious next step would be to look at a major improvement to the oldest unimproved game in the Monolith Soft catalogue, that being Xenoblade Chronicles 2. But now we get into a whole mass of problems. Unlike X, Xenoblade 2 has an extensive DLC, and unlike Breath of the Wild, they actually released it as a discrete physical game. Will Nintendo therefore just have one upgrade fee? Surely they'd need to up-res both, but what if some people have one title, but not the other? And then we need to consider the sheer amount of work that would be needed. Xenoblade Chronicles X released on Wii U with hardware that isn't a million miles from Switch's, and yet it released on Switch, as it always had to given the technological incompatibility with the Wii U, as a brand new fully priced game. Generally speaking, I wouldn't expect Nintendo to re-release games on compatible hardware when they could simply patch and upgrade previous versions, but it's not completely unprecedented either. Zelda Twilight Princess HD released on Wii U, a system perfectly capable of playing Zelda Twilight Princess. If Nintendo and Monolith Soft really want a new Xenoblade Chronicles 2 to be something to write home about, would they be better off not upgrading the prior game, but essentially remaking it with a new hardware? The game will be 10 years old next year, and that's the time frame that saw Xenoblade and most modern Zeldas get remastered. But if Nintendo is happy for the time being to give love to 3 and Definitive Edition alongside their own new titles, then this gives Monolith Soft plenty of time for the idea of a completely separate Xenoblade Chronicles 2 Definitive Edition game to go from a slightly cheeky move to something that would probably gain broad support and demand in its own right. If the secondary team are indeed working on Xenogears for 2030, then their next title would presumably be around 2035, and so we would probably be looking at the Switch 2 successor as the console in question. Well, bringing Xenoblade Chronicles 2 Remake to that system 18 years after the first title launched would be tapping into generational nostalgia in a big way by that point. Now look, while I've given a fair shake to the counter-argument, there is still a strong case for Xenoblade Chronicles 2 to be given that Nintendo Switch 2 edition. The graphical jump would allow them to justify probably a $20 surcharge, and that would ameliorate the additional costs of graphically developing an early Switch game to Switch 2 standards. It would refresh the least impressive game in the catalogue, and if the next full game is still a year or more away, it will be a solid placeholder title for 2026 or early 2027, and a strong inducement for the die-hard fans of that series to upgrade to Switch 2 if they have yet to do so. It might also subtly promote things like Torn of the Golden Country, which of course would drive further sales. Now, I tried to reflect my judgments in percentage terms so that I can review my accuracy later on. Therefore, I would give these forecasts at the present time. 90% I think there will be at least one Xenoblade Chronicles game by the end of 2030, whether a new title or a Nintendo Switch 2 edition, even if Monolith Soft ultimately do an original game as their next title, because I think Nintendo will try to keep the Xenoblade name alive. 70%. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 or Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition will receive a Nintendo Switch 2 edition or some kind of graphical uplift by the end of 2030. 30% Xenoblade Chronicles 2 will receive a full Nintendo Switch 2 edition by the end of 2030. I won't go into any longer-term prospects at this time, but I think there's a significant chance that when Xenoblade Chronicles 2 returns, as I'm sure it eventually will, it will be with a far more lavish upgrade than a Nintendo Switch 2 patch might provide. As always though, thank you for watching, thanks to the channel's Patreon members, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.